This is obviously based on the classic 1939 short story by James Thurber. As there was a previous film which John Goldwyn's grandfather produced from 1947, starring Danny Kaye. That original film is very different from the short story, and this film is very different from that film and the short story. Could maybe you and Ben and Steve talk a little bit about whether you found those two useful models at all, the original short story and the film?
Yeah, I mean, I came on relatively late in the process, but John and his dad really have had a long process of bringing the movie to the screen over many years. But basically, I think what happened was they had tried for a long time to remake the original movie in some way, which didn't really in any way necessarily story-wise connect to the original short story. And at a certain point, Steve Conrad, maybe you guys can speak to how it happened, came in with a totally different take on the story. And when I read that script, for me, that was what made me want to do it, because it felt so emotionally connected and relevant, because it got into the idea of who this guy was and why he was a daydreamer, and didn't try to redo what had already been done very well by Danny Kaye. Obviously, I couldn't do that. Nobody would want to see me attempt to do that. So I didn't want to attempt to do that. So anyway, it was. So that was really what was exciting to me, was that Steve took this idea, and I think it has the spirit of the original story and the character that Thurber created, which is very, it's obviously an iconic character. I don't know, do you want to talk about that at all?
Well, I can say, well, is this working yet? So when I got the call from Steve's agent saying that he'd like to take a shot at this, I said, Steve Conrad, are you kidding? You want to do this, really? Because I had such respect for Steve as a writer, incredible films that he'd written. And I remember my first conversation where he said, you know, every American male yearns to be on the cover of a Wheaties box. And I kind of understood or intuited what he was saying. I don't know if I completely understood it, but I was so intrigued. And that began this process, this journey with Steve, that really came to complete fruition with Ben and Steve. About the movie that you saw, but it was, he really saw a kernel of an idea that was very different from the old movie, and even different from Thurber's short story, that was uniquely his own.
Thank you, gentlemen. When I thought this was a challenge I wanted to accept, I was well aware that there had been iterations of the script for a while, and I thought I'm going to try to apply a greater challenge, excuse me, than just to turn the short story into a film. I began asking myself what Thurber might, if he were able to say more, what would he say next? And I started to write with that in mind, to continue rather than to translate or adapt. And primarily for me that meant finding out more of what Walter's conditions might have been like before he began daydreaming. And it's a gift for a writer to find a story that might have the promise of drawing us all together. And our imagination is one of those tools that we all use privately to move our lives forward, or to help deal with challenges, pain, and loss. But to have the chance to be able to write about one of our most magnificent faculties, I couldn't let pass me by. And I was given great space by the rest of our filmmakers to experiment with it, that I'm grateful for. I think it probably collectively it made a difference in this script being one that we were able to film.
Can you say a bit about the process of coming up with and integrating the fantasy sequences? Because there's, I imagine you had a lot of fun with that. There's often an element of the absurd to some of the fantasies, but they also serve a crucial function in terms of advancing the character, the narrative?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was really one of the facets of Steve's script right off the bat, was the idea that the fantasies in Walter's head related to parts of himself, who he could be or who he wanted to be, as opposed to being a different character, just elements of who Walter was under the surface that hadn't been realized. And obviously we want to have fun with it and enjoy the idea of being able to be in different worlds, and for the comedy to come out of it. But for me, that idea of like understanding how each fantasy leads him to becoming who he is and ultimately being able to realize his full self, that was really important. The challenge with it, which we found, and I guess it was in the first time around, you talked about this, John, when they were making the first movie, is that when you have fantasies that stop the story, an audience naturally wants to see the story unfold. So it's very challenging to keep the momentum going and to have the fantasies play out. So originally, we had envisioned these much more elaborate fantasies that went on a lot longer. And as we developed the script and worked on the script, we realized that we had to keep on paring them down. And that process sort of continued through the editing of the movie and finding that balance of how you could keep the momentum of the story going, but also having enough of the fantasies in there to give you a sense of what was going on inside Walter and just have fun. But we spent a lot of time, Jeff, Mann, and I, and the whole team envisioning all these crazy fantasies that we ended up having to cut both for budgetary reasons. There was like, originally there was a fantasy that happened on 6th Avenue when Walter and Cheryl are sitting by the fountain, where he had this Lawrence of Arabia fantasy where Ted and all of the guys who work for Ted come galloping up on horses looking like Anthony Quinn, and they grab Cheryl and they ride the horses down into the subway, and they go through the subway and they come out the other side and they're in in the desert, and then they end up like doing they end up singing the end song from Grease, right? I don't know what we did that. But I think it was money, basically. But that, we just realized as we went along we had to keep on paring it down. And then the other thing we learned in working on the story was it was very important to focus on Cheryl and Walter and the connection that they had together, because there's very little time in the story to develop that relationship before Walter goes out into the world. And so it really became important to focus the fantasies on Walter and Cheryl, and Walter wanting to connect with Cheryl. And so we kept on working on that all the way through the process of making the movie.
Can I add one thing? It's such a big departure in Ben and Steve's version of the movie from the old Danny Kaye and even Thurber, is that right from the beginning, there's something about the man's yearning that's revealed in the fantasies. Whereas in the Thurber and even in the old Danny Kaye movie, it's about retreat. So you get the sense of a man who really wants to figure out a way to make a connection in Steve's version of the movie in a way that you've never felt in any former iteration of the story.
Take some questions. Yep. We have microphones.